Hello, and welcome back to the Care Advocates, where we're advocating for you. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Sharon's son, Dr. George Ackerman. Welcome, George.
Thanks. Great to see you and be back with you for some more important topics throughout the world to discuss today.
Yes, and our good friend, Christina Keys, founder of Keys for Caregiving. Welcome, Christina. How are you?
I am great. I'm so excited to be here today with you too.
Always great to see you. Christina, before we start and get into the questions, why don't you take a brief moment and just share with the viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with you a little bit of your backstory?
Okay. Well, I was in tech for many years, had a great career, and then March 16th of 2013, I got a call that my mother had had a stroke. And I walked into that hospital not knowing if I was going to have to be leaving to make funeral arrangements or with my mother. I wound up leaving being a family caregiver. And that lasted for 10 years. And through that journey, I had to leave my career, recreate a career, and I saw the struggles that family caregivers went through, that I went through with my mother, created a nonprofit, started advocating all across the United States. My mother passed in 2022. And she made me promise to continue my work advocating for families because she didn't want families to go through what we went through.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here, and family caregivers are lucky to have you doing the advocacy that you're doing. You know, you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but let's drill in a little bit deeper on that, Christina, on when you became a caregiver and when you first said, you know what, I'm a family caregiver.
Yeah, honestly, for the first 3 months, I was just a daughter who didn't want her mother to die. And when I wheeled my mother out of that hospital, I was just a daughter trying to keep my mother alive. I didn't even realize what a caregiver was. I remember one of my first Facebook posts that came up, memories that came up, and my mother after 3 months, we had gone home, and I was trying to find care for her at home because I didn't know how to hire care. And I put on Facebook, does anybody know if they have like babysitters, but for adults? I didn't even know the term caregiver, right? And here I was literally now a case manager, a PT, an OT, a med manager, a CNA, a nurse, a bath aide, all of these things, and a caregiver. So it took me a while to realize I was a family caregiver and I wanted to be a daughter. I wanted to be a daughter, but I was caring on a daily basis. And for me to find the resources I needed to take on that title. I needed to search that title.
Absolutely. And, I think you just said something that is very common among caregivers everywhere. And I don't know about necessarily, George, if your experience was the same, but for myself and my wife, we were in our early 20s, we were newlyweds, and we get a call out of the blue that my father either needed to come stay with us for a few weeks or he was going to go into rehab for a few weeks. And, we said what I think most children would say, well, no, he can come stay with us. We had our house and, albeit, I was pursuing medical school. My wife already graduated and she was done and settled in her career. But at the word caregiver, family caregiver, that never crossed my lexicon. And that couple of weeks ended up being over 2.5 years and 7 major surgeries. And home health typically will only come out 1 to 3 times a week. And they're going to be there for 45 minutes, hour at the max. And they're only there for that specific healthcare need. They're not going to bathe, groom, toilet, and dress somebody or make sure they even have fresh milk and groceries in their fridge, let alone needing prescriptions refilled. We were doing all that. And we thought that was the norm. Even 2.5 years later, I never said, wow, I was a family caregiver. And we were left trying to figure it out on our own, like so many people, like your experience too, Christina. And I just think, sadly, that hasn't really changed. That's the norm still to this day with the, countless numbers of families that we encounter with our company, the countless number of caregivers I talk to on this show or other shows. We're failing family caregivers by giving them the information they need when they need it. We're finding it out after the fact. We need it during the fact. And, the advocacy that you're doing and, the large, kind of bully pulpit that you scream it from is so needed. And that's why we do what we do here at the Care Advocates. And, as always, I'll say it again, thank you for everything you're doing. And I don't know. I'll switch it over to George. And George, what do you want to talk about?
Thanks. Well, welcome again, Christina. And I wanted to let you know and the world that you inspire me and so many with all the things that you've been through, but still keep fighting in memory of your loved one, but also for so many still out there battling. I just wanted to also state that a lot of what you just mentioned when you started out, I felt the same way as Lance mentioned. I was wondering, the moment you realized that you're now something called a caregiver, how did you feel and what was your, racing through your mind? Because as Lance mentioned, and I felt, I walked in once, it was late at night, and not to get too in depth, and I found my mother at 4 a.m. having delusions, hallucinations, which I never even heard of before at the time. And due to Parkinson's disease, was moving her furniture outside of her home, thought there were Nazis inside, and I showed up. And that was where my caregiving journey began. And that's why, again, it's so important the three of us join together and really continue to advocate. But it's curious, that was my kind of aha moment and sad one. But I was wondering, when you were hit in a way, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, with that aha moment that you mentioned earlier, what were you feeling? And, how did you decide that you were going to now fight for your loved one and so many others today?
Well, first thing I want to say is, what's common about our story and so many other stories is it changed in an instant for all three of us. Me and Lance got the call, you walked in, and everything changed for us. But we had no idea, like, how much it was going to change for us. We had no idea that the whole course of our life was going to change, right? And when I realized this was going to happen, it was overwhelming for me, because I felt like many caregivers feel, everything I did was life or death. Everything I did mattered. Everything, and I didn't know. I always describe caregiving as being afraid of heights, flying a plane while you're building a plane without a toolbox and without instructions. And that's what caregiving is. And even if there was a beautiful book, What to Expect When Caregiving, I don't think any of us would have read it before, because none of us is like, well, I'm just going to be prepared to care. We think that it's not going to happen to us, right? And so when we get thrown into it, it's a little tough. And I was very overwhelmed, and I wasn't sleeping because I was constantly thinking about, man, I should have done this, or I could have done this, or what if, and I was traumatized by walking into that hospital, and they told me my mom had 1% chance to live, and for the first 30 days, they didn't know. And so for that first 3 years, I was sleeping 5 to 10 hours a week, and constantly stressed. And honestly, what happened for me, I think we all know some of the things that happen with family caregivers. We suffer a lot of physical challenges ourselves because we put ourselves on the back burner, mental challenges. And for me, I became physically, financially, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually and socially bankrupt, right? And within 3 years, I went to the doctor's office. I had to leave my career, and they told me, Christina, you maybe have 6 months to live. That's where my caregiving had taken me. The worry of constantly, am I doing this right? The challenge of having to learn as I go, and to learn being in that crisis constantly. We're going to the hospital a lot. There's a lot of life and death things, and a lot of things. It's very interesting because on our caregiving journey, those things that in the beginning we were like, oh my God, mom is going to die, now became our baseline. It's like, no, mom is just, this is just a Tuesday, right? And it's not an emergency, but we didn't know that in the beginning. So it's challenging, and it's challenging for a lot of caregivers that way. And I think the stats that I heard were like 30% of caregivers pass before the person they're caring for, 35% of them pass within 5 years of the person they're caring for, and caregivers who are over the age of 70, 65% of them pass before the person they're caring for. So we are in a challenging situation, stepping up and saying, I love you and I will do anything for you because I think your life is worth it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Christina, I want to kind of piggyback on what George had said. He had his aha moment. You and I at some point had an aha moment. For me, I knew I was caring for my dad, but my aha is like, oh, I'm a caregiver, wasn't really until after he had to go into a facility because his needs became greater than what could be provided for in the home. What were some of your biggest challenges, though, on your care journey? We all have financial challenges. For me, it was really time and getting support because I was the sole, my wife helped, but she's working a career and full time, and we have bills. And, I'm working at the university in the labs and doing student teaching and still pursuing, medical school. So you can't just go and work, a 9 to 5 job. So that was a challenge. But what was the challenge for you?
Well, I think, one of the challenges was, I was working a 9 to 5 job, B2B, and I couldn't do that anymore. Mom, there was so many hospital visits, so many doctor's visits. I think I had 2 weeks of vacation and 5 sick days in my job. That started every January. Well, by February, I had used all of that, taking mom to the hospital. And I remember that day leaving my job, my career. I'd worked for 20 years. I was really, really good at my career and worked for 20 years to get to where I was. And having to leave, I think that was the longest elevator ride of my life because I stepped into that elevator, Christina, the career woman. And when those doors opened, that's when I realized I was Christina, the caregiver, and I was completely lost, And so that was one of the biggest challenges. And also realizing everything that I wished and dreamed of was going to be put on hold, and really coming face to face with the fact that, I mean, we all know our parents are going to die one day, but coming face to face with the fact that mom could die any minute, and she is going to, and I'm going to be like, and a lot of it depends on how well I care, is what I felt like. So those were some of the biggest challenges. And of course, the financial. I mean, I lost everything. I went from, making $100,000 plus a year to standing in food bank lines with just 2 years,
Yeah.
all because I was paying for mom's care and her needs.
Yeah. Did you, during that, time of your life, did you have any experiences with the healthcare staff or social workers or community resources that were ever offered or shared with you at all? Or was it really you're just left to figure it out yourself?
So I did what a lot of caregivers do. We assume that the doctors and nurses will have resources, because we're there and they're dealing with these people. And so I kept asking. I lived in the hospital with my mother for 3 months. And when I say lived with, I had a suitcase. I slept in that chair. I went home once a week to shower, right? Because I lived 3 hours away. And everybody who came in, even if I was too tired, I would say, I'm really exhausted. I haven't slept. Can I record? I have a couple questions. And they never they gave me a list of in-home care, but they didn't tell me it wasn't covered by insurance. And they gave me a list of senior living locations. They didn't give me any details about that, right? And so that was one of the reasons that it led me to having that diagnosis from doctors that you only have 6 months to live, because there was no resources. I thought there was no resources in my town. And so when I left my career and had to change my career, I went into the senior and retirement industry, and I found all of these resources in my own town, like hundreds of them. And so it changed the scope of my caring. It made me a better caregiver. It saved my life. And it helped me to provide much better care for my mother, these resources. And a lot of them were, a lot of these resources, some of the most valuable ones were the ones that were the nonprofits, the small, or the solopreneurs that like had one person running them, that didn't have the big advertising budgets, that I would have never found out about if I wouldn't have been going around town and asking. And so that's when I created the nonprofit, because I wanted other caregivers to know.
No, that's incredible. George, let's go back to you.
Yeah, well, we send our love and support to you and your whole family, especially during the holidays, and everybody listening too. Unfortunately, in your case, it wasn't just your mother you cared for. You've come through other obstacles in your life. I was wondering if you could share that with us. And also, I don't know if there are differences between caring between one loved one and another, but maybe you could share those too.
Yeah. So I cared for my mother from 2013 to 2022. And I had a 20-year relationship with a wonderful man named Terry. In 2019, we decided to separate because caregiving made it so our relationship didn't survive, but we were still best friends. As a matter of fact, I couldn't afford to move out on my own, and so we were roommates. And 5 months later, he wound up having a stroke, and I became his caregiver. And I was his caregiver until 2022 when I had to put him into an adult family home. Now, both of them had a stroke, but they had two different types of strokes. And he wasn't paralyzed. My mother was paralyzed. She was wheelchair bound. He was not, but he had mobility issues, had to walk with a walker. He had issues with, he kept, asphyxiating and choking. He had some other issues. And the differences between those two was my mom had Medicare and we had to do a Medicaid spin down with him. So I had to walk through our house and everything we had, like, you know, that went to the state. And then I had to deal with challenges where I had to get him a state representative so he could get put into the adult family home, and nothing would. I was so worried because there are so many loopholes when it comes to Medicaid. If you do one thing wrong, and it's not as simple as you just automatically qualify. You have to get on disability, then you have to get on long-term care, then you have to get on the spin down. I mean, it's very complicated. You do one thing wrong and they could lose their insurance. And so I had to bring in a state representative and turn over my responsibilities to them, which was really hard. I felt like a failure, but I knew in the long run, that was the most loving and most responsible thing I could do for Terry. And I still see him today. As a matter of fact, I just went to go see him the other day. And, I think what was hard about it was because he was my partner, I knew all of his dreams. I knew what our dreams were. I knew what his plans for retirement was. He had a stroke in his early 50s, and, so here I was caring for my mom, heartbreak of him, heartbreak of, all of that, and caring for two people, working full time. And, in the midst of that, 2022 was a tough year for me. 2022, my dad died, who I was not his caregiver, April 30th. May 9th, Terry had his last stroke, and so I had to start the procedures to get him put into an adult family home. My mom went on hospice on my birthday, Thanksgiving. She died December 28th. So it's challenging caring for a couple, and you got to explain to those people multiple times when they've got cognitive issues about how somebody died, about how somebody is going in a different living situation. They ask multiple times, and you've got to push down your emotions. I don't know how many times mom asked, "Where's dad?" You've got to push down your emotions and just answer that question and not do what you want to do with that grief and say, "Stop asking me that." You got to say, well, very calmly, they're in heaven now.
Yeah, well, I thank you for being so open and honest. I think that in my dream through the show and Lance too, if we just reach one person out there in the world that might feel alone or maybe be in not the same, but similar situation of all of ours, and we've changed the world for the better. So I want to thank you for that. And also hope we could dedicate today in memory of your mother and also for Terry, who's still fighting today.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. I want to kind of talk a little bit about, George was talking about the differences in, caring for, two individuals, but how was advocating for your mom different and the same versus caring or advocating for Terry? What were some of the similarities, but what were some of the differences?
Well, I was very fortunate that it was a learning process advocating for mom. And the biggest thing about advocating for a loved one, when you're a new caregiver, your emotions get in the way, right? And you're really tired. And the thing is, when you're advocating for a loved one, you can't say the things your feelings want to say. You can't yell, you can't scream. You have to be very calm and very professional in order for the medical teams, the billing teams, all the people, the specialists, to listen to you. And so it took me a while to learn some of the language, some of the terminology, some of the correct people to talk to. I had to learn the difference between, a patient advocate, the social worker, and a discharge planner, all of these things. And so I was very fortunate that by the time Terry had his stroke, I knew quite a bit of the terminology. I knew who to talk to in the hospital. I knew how to keep my composure no matter how angry I was, no matter what kind of mistreatment there was going on or anything. And so that was some of the, similarities. Some of the differences were, I was my mother's primary caregiver. There was nobody in the way, right? Or questioning me, right? Because they knew I had it. And with Terry, even though I'd been with Terry for 20 years and his family wasn't very involved, he loved his family. His family and him were very close. But when some of the harder decisions came about, like the selling of the property and things like that, that's when I had to bring in some professionals because they thought it was personal, some of the things I was doing and some of the decisions I was making. And they were not personal. They were the legal things I needed to do to protect Terry's interest and his insurance. And they didn't understand no matter how I explained it. And that's okay. They hadn't walked through that before. I hadn't walked through it before. I had a tiny bit more education than them on that. And it's a very confusing process. So that was definitely a challenge that I had to walk through with Terry and not my mother. And I know I talk to family caregivers all across the United States, and whether it's immediate family or people who have a vested interest. And I can tell you also, one of the biggest things is when people get close to the end, when people are about to die, people who have not been part of your care journey come in and they want to give their opinion, and you've got to advocate for your loved one. I mean, even in my mother's situation, I had no money to bury her, and everybody kept saying, what little money I had, and there was stuff I could sell, just cremate her, because they wanted me to sell and they thought maybe they can get some of the money. I'm like, those were not my mother's wishes. I will bury her based on her wishes. So people come in and because they think it's just a sad fact that when somebody's going to die, there are people who, come in and want to try to get that money. So, your advocating isn't just while you're caring for somebody. It's during the end of life process. It is like I had a conversation with somebody yesterday about, bringing flowers to my mother's grave on Christmas. And they're like, how long do you have to do that? I'm like, I never have to do that. But I'm her daughter and I will do that. And that's, and so we still advocate even after they're gone for something as simple as bringing flowers to their grave.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great insights, Christina. I want to go back to George. George?
Thanks. Yeah, we've been talking about some important topics, and one thing that we hope for the care advocates and all the audience is to also kind of learn and kind of teach something. I was wondering if you had any lessons for the audience and that could help with, just navigating or even dealing, unfortunately, with hospitals, because we all know whether it's emergency room or just generally the hospital, it's not the most exciting place that we even want to find ourselves. And when you're there, it's usually not for good reasons, although we love our doctors. My father's one. He's actually in a procedure himself right now for kidneys. So hopefully he's doing well. But I was just curious what, even a few tips that you might have been able to learn and discover through your journey with your mother and Terry that others might be able to kind of understand so they don't also have to go through the same type of kind of chaotic mess like I did, at least when I was going through the hospital scenario, whether ER or general with my mother.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it can be tough, right? It
Yeah,
can be tough.
that might be another podcast for another.
Yeah, that could be a whole podcast series, like life in the hospital as a caregiver. But one of the things that I learned that became very convenient for me was, I had a to-go bag for my mom. It had like her glasses in it, her cell phone charger, her special blanket, all of these things. And after a while, because we were going to the hospital so much, I put together a to-go bag for me. It had a charger, a blanket, my vitamins, a bottle so I could fill with water, some healthy snacks in it. I think coloring books is what I had in it, and just some things like that. And so I kept that in my car, almost like if you have a child, to keep a diaper bag, right? And so this was my caregiver on the go bag, right? And so that was one thing I had because, look, we are in a high stress situation in the hospital. I mean, that's why they have an emergency room, because there's an emergency going on, right? And so if you can do any tiny thing to have some kind of self-care, something as simple as having your, caregiver bag that has your cell phone charger in it, because you didn't know you were going to wind up in the hospital and you didn't charge your phone, and now it's there, right? If you take blood pressure pills, you have that in there, right? If you, whatever, it's there, right? So that's one of the first suggestions I would say. I would say there are simple ways to do self-care there. Like, once your person is stable and everything's okay and you have a minute and rounds aren't happening, take a minute, go get some water, do a lap around the nurse's station, just so you can think clearly. Because especially if you have a patient who has chronic illnesses that is in the hospital a lot, or who is aging, you got to remember our hospital systems these days. A lot of times the way they're set up is these doctors have maybe 10, 15 minutes with each patient. It's not personal. It's the guidelines that they work under. And so sometimes they don't have the greatest bedside manner. They don't have time to read the charts. And if you're lucky, they'll team up with you, right? They understand that, right? But they don't always understand that, especially if it's somebody new to the doctor's team, right? So you need to keep your composure, right? It's important to keep your composure. Make sure that you have numbers in your phone of people who you can be texting, so you can say the things you want to say to the doctors who aren't listening to you. And it's okay to, if those doctors are not listening to you, because even though you're keeping your composure, even though you're stating facts that are important, you're talking about their baseline, how their baseline has changed. You're not just flying out the handle and being dramatic, because you are their 24/7 doctor, right? And if you're having communication issues with that doctor, you can ask to have a patient advocate. And most hospitals have a patient advocate there at the hospital come in. And that patient advocate, really, they're not on the doctor's side or on your side. They're there to be able to make sure the doctor isn't taking anything personally, you aren't taking anything personally, but making sure actual communication happens rather than feelings are happening and people aren't listening, right? So a patient advocate is somebody you talk to if you are not having a successful time communicating with the doctor, right? You can also talk to, if you have, talk to one of the nurses there and see if they have any suggestions on how to communicate with that particular doctor, right? So, and I always did things like I would bring like a bowl of candy and put it in there, to my mom's room if she was going to be in there for a couple days. I try to, first thing when I get into the hospital, if mom is going to be in the hospital for a few days or a week, I try to make it very clear, look, I'd like to be part of the team. I'm a walking, portfolio of mom's baseline of everything she goes through. I know how she communicates, how she reacts. I would like to be part of the team and make your guys' job as easy as I can. Please let me help you in any way I can. And I, when I'm here, I don't mind being the second person. If you guys don't have a scene, I don't mind helping change it. I try to team up. I'd love to help, not I'm going to help. There's a difference between I'd love to be a part of the team, I'd love to help, rather than I'm going to. These doctors and nurses, we have to remember that these hospitals are understaffed. They're under a lot of stress, and we are under a lot of stress too. So maybe if we can try to be kind, it's going to help us out as well. And when they aren't kind, I remember this one time I was going to counseling, and this counselor said, well, what's your main reason for being here? I said, well, I'm angry. She said, why? She said, well, because I'm a caregiver. She says, I don't understand. I said, 10 years of keeping my mouth shut in hospitals and with insurance companies, you would understand, So but we have to. So make sure you also have some friends or a care coach or somebody who you can vent to. So because you are going to be frustrated because there's a lot of fears that are going to come up when you're in that hospital or that ER.
I want to kind of stick there for a minute, Christina, because I think you really hit on something that, whether you're a caregiver or not a caregiver, something that people need to know how to advocate for is when they're dealing with the insurance company and medical bills. What do you think is key for people advocating when it comes to these hospital bills and insurance companies?
Make sure you have some time set aside. Do not expect that you are going to be able to make a 15-minute phone call, right? Make sure you have all the information. Make sure you have all of the insurance coverage information in front of you, the supplement coverage information, any codes that you need, right? Make sure that you have because the insurance companies a lot of time will say, well, we can't take care of that. You got to call the doctor's office. Then you call the doctor's office. Doctor's office says you got to call the insurance company, and you're going back and forth. This is just the process. If we know that it's not personal, this is just the horrific process of dealing with insurance companies. And now a lot of insurance companies have had to outsource too. And so very generic information. Uh, for me, I had to just make sure I knew this is the process. It's going to take a long time. The more prepared I am with the most information, the easier it's going to go. But it's going to take, I would set aside anywhere from 5 to 8 hours if I needed to call Medicare. So, I mean, sadly, that's what it would take. Or if I needed to call AMR.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look back on, the advocacy you gave for your mom and Terry, and even with dealing with the hospital and the insurance and the billing, what would Christina do today that maybe you wished you would have known or did do back then?
Well, obviously, in the beginning, I would have been more prepared. I wish I would have known what a nightmare it was, to deal with the insurance. I wish I would have known, um, like for instance, Medicaid. I thought once you get on disability, you automatically have long-term care. That's not the process. I didn't know that getting on disability, you are always denied 99% of the time. You are denied the very first time. And the reason why they do that is because it saves them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was actually downstairs on a break one time. I worked at this tech company, and I was downstairs on a break, and I worked the Social Security office was in the same building, and the girl was down there talking. She said, we literally don't even read half the cases because we just automatically deny them because it saves us so much money. And I had to be in like full-blown stalker mode, like call once a week and be super sweet to the case manager for Terry and be like, hey, and just be honest, say, hey, I know that it gets denied the first time. What can I do? How can I team up and make this process easier for both of us? And persistence, and then once you get that insurance, like if you have Medicaid, everybody thinks Medicaid is all paid for. It is. But what a lot of people don't know is many agencies only take like anywhere from 7 to 12% of their caseload for Medicaid, right? So you're on waiting lists. So you've got to be persistent and be nice when you're being persistent, because if you're not nice, you're not going to get anywhere, and you can get off the phone and call your best friend and say what you really want to say. So, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Good advice, Christina. George?
Yeah, for my final area, something very important to the show. It's in the name of the show, but a lot of time I neglected it. It's not, I don't know if it's on purpose, but when I was caring for my mother, wanted her to feel comfortable, and she only did that when I was around her. So I would kind of neglect myself and my own health to ensure hers was okay as a caregiver. And then today, as an advocate, as Lance well knows, I do the same thing many nights. I don't sleep, just trying to ensure the world is aware of Parkinson's disease so we can find a cure. I was wondering what types of things you do to really care for yourself? Because as we are all told with a hammer over our head that, many different examples, but you have to take care of yourself first. So it's the number one rule, even though I don't, that's my issue. But it's curious, what you could share with the audience as to how you care for yourself first. Otherwise, and you'll probably agree that it's difficult to care for our loved ones if we're not, up, healthy, and able to help them and support them.
Right, right. Very good points. I got that. I resisted self-care. Obviously, I kept thinking as a caregiver, if you only knew,
Yeah.
I have my job, I have my life, and then now I'm caring for my mom. I don't have time to care for myself. Well, when I got that diagnosis of you only have 6 months to live, I didn't have a choice, right? And my first act of self-care was taking a blood pressure pill and texting a friend and saying I did for 30 days. And by that time, my body was so heavy with weight that I had gained. My body was so heavy with trauma, lack of sleep, from being in survival mode that really I couldn't do a lot of exercising. And so I had to do things like when I was walking down the hall, reach up to the ceiling. To try to get my body moving. But the biggest thing I had to do for self-care was redefine self-care. And I think this is important for anybody who has to incorporate self-care into their life and they've had a life change, whether you're a caregiver or whether you've all of a sudden had a child or, well, after 9 months had a child, or you get a new pet or you change your job and your work schedule's changed. Your life was one way and your self-care was like before caregiving, I was going to traveling, I was getting massages, I was getting mani-pedis, all of these things. Well, now caregiving, I don't have the time for that. I don't have the funds for that. So I had to redefine my normal. What can I do? What kind of time do I have? What kind of finances do I have? Right. So, what does self care look like? It's not mani pedis. It's taking a blood pressure pill and texting a friend. It's having a caregiver on the go bag. It's taking a lap around the nurse's station, right? So, the first thing, most important, redefine your normal because your life has changed. Redefine what self care can be for you and try to find if you can only do 30-second acts of self care, then find 30-second acts of self care, right? And do those. And caregiver recovery, right? We're in our caregiver recovery phase where our lives changed. We're affected financially, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, and socially. So obviously, we're going to have to rebuild those parts of our life, right? Again, I can't just go out and get mani-pedis, vacation, all this other stuff. And now, because my mind is so, jumbled up with grief and who am I and all of these things, I can't think straight. I had to come up with, I came up with these jars. There was 3 jars. There was one for free and under $10 of things that I could do, things I've always wanted to try, places I've always wanted to go, one for under $50 and one for over $50. And so when I wanted to do something and I couldn't figure it out, that was self-care, I would pick something and it would say go for a walk or
Yeah.
paint your own nails, simple.
Thank you. And just want to tell you that just in our short conversation, I've learned so much from you. And I have a feeling the world will also be a better place now through all the lessons you've shared and through your journey. I wanted to thank you and send it back to Lance for any final question.
Yeah, right before we close, Christina, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about this a little bit. Like so many caregivers, like George, myself, and you, and the countless others out there, we've taken really our unexpected caregiving journey and have now turned it into helping others. How do you advocate for other caregivers with the work that you're doing at, Keys for Caregiving, which we'll put up on the screen here, or you can find Christina at ChristinaKeys.com. Share with our audience how the help you're offering caregivers and where they can find you at, and, talk a little bit about that journey you're on now.
Well, I do some small coaching for caregivers, one-on-one coaching, but my main thing that I do is I speak all over advocating for caregivers. I do a lot of political advocacy for caregivers. I do a lot of speaking on the caregiver journey itself, caregiver recovery. I also work with companies to consult with how to reach family caregivers, because I think they know how to reach the seniors and the people they're caring for, but there's not as much, they're not as good at reaching family caregivers. And I help with building community. Those are my specialties that I help with, especially with startups. They're just starting out. I help them get the biggest impact they can on the community and caregivers and grow that quickly for them.
No, that's wonderful, Christina. And, do you want to leave any parting wisdom for family caregivers and their loved ones here at the end?
Well, if you are on a caregiver journey, what I would say is find a support system, find a support group, or find a care coach. A support group is very, very important. You can do that by tapping into places like Caregiver Action Network, all kinds of Daughterhood. All of those folks can help you out. Support group is really going to change the scope. And just find today, I would challenge you to find one 30-second act of self-care that you can add into your caregiving routine, and know that you are not alone.
No, that's always probably my number one favorite piece of advice, is knowing you're not alone, because that feeling of loneliness and isolation is just, it's a horrible feeling, and you can, if you're not careful, get trapped in there, and can take a while to get out of it once you are. And you're on social media too, correct? And you have a YouTube channel?
Absolutely. Yeah, Keys for Caregiving. I've got TikTok, YouTube. I got a lot of videos on YouTube. You'll hear your story a lot on the YouTube channel. You'll see a lot of your story.
All right. Well, Dr. George Ackerman, Sharon's son. George, thank you, George. Always good to see you, my friend. Christina, always a pleasure. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for supporting the Care Advocates, and we'll see you again here next month. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us again here this month at the Care Advocates, where we're advocating for you. We'd also like to say thank you to our guest, Christina Keys, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again here next month.